let's check in with our old buddy, Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, author of numerous books. His most recent, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, also now available as an ebook. Democracyatwork.info, rdwolff with 2fs.com, and Prof Wolff with 2fs over on Twitter. Professor Wolff, welcome back. We've got Omicron, staring down our throats. Mike, the county where I live, talking about, hey, make sure you've got a month's worth of groceries. People batten down the hatches. What is this going to do to the economy? What has Omicron or what has COVID done in the larger context to the economy? Are there historical parallels? People are making inflation parallels to the end of World War II, for example, with supply chain disruptions and whatnot. Give us the big picture here and then also the micro view of what we can expect over the next few months.
Well, I'm going to try, Tom, but given the chaotic flow of news that is often contradictory, it is unusually difficult to say. Here are some things, though, to keep in mind. Every effort now being made by all the players in a capitalist economy that risk bringing a bad reputation upon them are trying to avoid that outcome by blaming COVID. Some of that is reasonable. A large part of it is not. It's really important to understand that. First of all, we had an economic crash that began in February of 2020, not long, but before the COVID pandemic hit us, which is usually dated March of that year, in other words, later. And so what we have here is a combination of both a public health disaster and an economic crash. The government of the United States and the people who run this country knew, should have known, probably did know, that both of these likelihoods could happen and that they could happen together, which would be a kind of worst-case scenario. But instead of preparing for that, they acted like it couldn't or wouldn't happen, and so we were unprepared for both of these disasters and doubly unprepared for their handling together. And it really traumatized the United States. I think everything from the massive number of people quitting their jobs to a strike wave of the dimensions we haven't seen for decades in this country, the divisions in our society, all of these things are symptoms of an accumulation of problems. Having said all that, and having said that we seem remarkably incapacitated, we can't deal with these problems. We weren't ready for COVID. We haven't coped with COVID very well. I remind everyone, we are 4.5% of the world's population in this country, and we have over 16% of the world's deaths. That is a lamentable failure, and my fear is that we're going to have a 2022 in which this Omicron item is going to bring everyone back to a horrible reconfrontation with the way it was for the last 2 years. Every effort will be made by our politically dysfunctional system to gain some sort of advantage, whether it is being against vaccine mandates or it's being against Build Back Better solutions, or it will be the excuse we don't need to do something because there's an inflation. I mean, when you look at the scale of the problems that this society has, now worsened by the inflation, now worsened by the supply chain disruptions, and by the way, those two things are literally causes of one another, you really have to wonder how the United States is going to ever get through a level of dysfunction combined with these threats to it. And one last point that has to be said. We did not share with the rest of the world the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that were heavily paid for by the government in advance, as well as promising to buy and pay for the vaccination of the United States' population. But by limiting to that, not sharing that with the rest of the world, not permitting other countries to produce by giving them the formulas. You have allowed huge portions of the world to go unvaccinated and therefore to be a place where new mutations, such as the Omicron we're now facing, can develop. And nothing is being done to basically alter this picture, which means that the frightening notion that we are still at the beginning of a sequence of these disasters makes a certain amount of sense. But it's a level of dysfunction, if I can conclude by answering your question of historical parallels. Yeah, I think there are. And the biggest one that we ought to be thinking about is that the feudal system of Europe never recovered from the pandemic called the Black Death or the bubonic plague back in the 13th and 14th century. It took a few more hundred years for the system to finally collapse, but it never recovered from the shock and the disruption, which in nowadays you would call disrupted supply chains and inflations, which is what they had then too. That should give us pause about whether we are confronted with a threat to the economic system we live in, and that we are not beginning to come up with a bevy of tools needed to confront a threat that big. And having now seen Senator Manchin shoot down the little modest effort that the Build Back Better had become, you are watching almost in slow motion the incapacity to cope that is becoming the number one theme of the economic system we're living in.
Right. And just for the record, the Biden administration has been calling for the so-called TRIPS waivers for the third world to be able to make vaccines. The barrier here in the World Trade Organization has been Germany under Merkel. Now there's a new, what's his name, Scholz.
Scholz.
Yeah. You've got a new prime minister. I don't recall, he's only been in office for a week or two. I don't recall if he's made any public pronouncements about the TRIPS waivers. Do you know? Because if he was to change his mind, if he was to change Germany's position, then we could get that. I was thinking about, for my op-ed for today, writing a piece that, Omicron is God's way of saying you should have shared the patent.
Absolutely.
Punishing you for greedy pharma companies.
Well, European newspapers, and I'm in no position to make a judgment that's worth anything here, but in a lot of European newspapers, the argument is made that it is Pfizer and Moderna with the collusion of the United States government that is holding all of this back because Pfizer wants to make more money before it does all of this stuff. I don't know. I mean, I can't validate or verify these things. But what I know is that in the long run, history won't be all that interested in who did or didn't do something. Right. If the Germans or any country were the obstacle, then we're still left with why did not all of the other countries do the appropriate end run around the one or two that held back in the name of the human race, if not.
I'm with you. I think that has to do with the WTO being, like the European Union, a consensus-based organization. But I noticed that the Goldman Sachs just cut our GDP forecast for this year. Are you seeing an economic slowdown as a result of this, or do you think that because this virus is moving so fast that it's going to burn through the country in just a matter of a few months, and by the end of the year, by the end of next year, by the end of 2020, 1 year from now, we will be starting, at least economically, to get back to normal?
The problem is you can't reason like that, Tom, because over the next 6 months, 12 months, there'll be another Omicron, perhaps, in all those parts of the world that still aren't vaccinated at all, right, and that are therefore breeding grounds. And we now know that even with vaccine, you can get the disease again, which means that many more opportunities for yet other mutations. Right. I think you're absolutely right to focus that Goldman Sachs does not want to have to make a prediction like that because, among other things, it's going to hurt them. And they're doing that because they feel they have to protect their clients in order to keep them, and so they're saying what can't be said by others in the hopes that it'll make the kind of difference that their clients expect them to make. And I'm afraid they have a lot of information beyond what we already know to indicate that we are in for another shock, and the only question is how long and how bad it'll be.